There are phone calls that emergency dispatchers receive that they can never quite forget. Calls that echo in their minds long after their shifts end, long after they've gone home to their own families. The call that came into the Norton Shores Police Department on the morning of July 6, 2022, was one of those calls. On the other end of the line was a young man's voice, measured and oddly calm for someone reporting what should have been an unimaginable tragedy. His name was Paul Ferguson, and he was calling to report that his 15-year-old brother Timothy was dead. The dispatcher asked the standard questions, her training kicking in even as something about this call felt off. How did he die? When did you find him? Is anyone performing CPR? Paul's answers were clinical, detached, as if he were reporting a broken appliance rather than the death of his younger brother. Timothy had fallen from his bunk bed, Paul explained. He'd been found in the basement. No, they weren't performing CPR. It was too late for that. The way Paul spoke, each word carefully chosen, each pause precisely timed, it was as though he'd rehearsed this conversation, as though he knew this call was coming. When Officer Shanda Vander Ark arrived at the modest two-story home on Marshall Road in Norton Shores, Michigan, nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. The house looked ordinary from the outside, the kind of middle-class suburban home you'd pass without a second glance. There were no outward signs of the horror contained within those walls. No indication that this residence had been the site of systematic torture, a place where a child had been slowly, methodically destroyed by the very person who was supposed to protect him. Stephanie was led down to the basement by a woman who introduced herself as Shanda Vander Ark, Timothy's mother. She was 42 years old, well-spoken, composed. She worked as a law clerk at the Nuevo County Circuit Court. She'd attended law school and had extensive legal knowledge. She was by all appearances an educated, professional woman. But as they descended those basement stairs, Stephanie noticed something that made his skin crawl. Security cameras. They were everywhere. Mounted in corners, positioned in hallways, covering every angle of the home. What kind of family needed this level of surveillance? In the basement, Stephanie found Timothy Ferguson's body in a makeshift bathtub, and the sight would haunt him for the rest of his career. Later in court, he would struggle to find the words to describe what he saw. Skin and bones, he finally said, his voice breaking slightly. He was just skin and bones. Timothy Ferguson was 68 inches tall, 5 feet 8 inches, the height of an average teenage boy. But he weighed only 69 pounds. 69 pounds. To put that in perspective, a healthy 15-year-old boy of that height should weigh somewhere between 130 and 150 pounds. Timothy weighed less than half of that. He weighed less than many 8-year-old children. But it wasn't just the weight. Timothy's body told a story of prolonged suffering, of torture that had gone on for months. His skin was mottled with bruises in various stages of healing, some fresh, some old, creating a grotesque map of pain across his emaciated frame. His ribs protruded so sharply they looked ready to pierce through his skin. There was no body fat, no muscle mass. Dr. Joyce DeJong, the Muskegon County medical examiner who would later perform Timothy's autopsy, said his body was literally breaking down, consuming itself in a desperate attempt to survive. His ligaments had begun to detach. His organs were failing. This wasn't a boy who had missed a few meals. This was a child who had been systematically starved to death. Shanda Vander Ark told the officers a story. Timothy had been difficult lately, she explained. He had behavioral issues. He'd been refusing to eat, going on what she called a hunger strike. The night before, he'd fallen from his bunk bed in the basement where he slept. They'd found him this morning, already gone. It was tragic, she said, her voice steady. They tried their best with Timothy, but he had special needs, and sometimes, despite your best efforts, these things happen. She spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed, someone used to her words carrying weight. After all, she worked in the legal system. She understood how these investigations worked. But Officer Stephanie wasn't buying it. Nothing about this scene made sense. The basement where Timothy had allegedly been sleeping wasn't a bedroom. It was cold, unfinished. the kind of space you'd use for storage, not for a child to sleep in. And that bathtub, why was there a bathtub in the basement? Why was Timothy's body soaking wet? If he'd fallen from a bunk bed, why was he in water? Stephanie looked at Shanda Vander Ark, really looked at her and saw something that chilled him more than the temperature of that basement. She wasn't sad. She wasn't grieving. She was calculating, watching him, trying to gauge whether he was accepting her story. The investigation moved quickly. Detective Stephanie Alm took over the case, and within hours of beginning her work, she knew this was no accident. This was murder. The house on Marshall Road wasn't just a home, it was a prison. It was a carefully designed torture chamber where a vulnerable child had been systematically abused, degraded, and ultimately killed. As detectives searched the residence, they found evidence that painted a picture so horrifying, so utterly devoid of humanity, that seasoned investigators found themselves stepping outside to catch their breath, to try to process what they were seeing. The pantry had a lock on it. Not a child-proof lock, but a heavy-duty padlock, the kind you'd use to secure a storage unit. The refrigerator was the same. Both were locked, preventing Timothy from accessing food. In the basement they found restraints, handcuffs, leg irons, zip ties. They found a closet where Timothy had been forced to sleep, a space so small that he couldn't fully lie down. They found surveillance footage from those ubiquitous cameras, hundreds of hours of recordings that documented Timothy's suffering in excruciating detail. And they found text messages. Thousands of text messages between Shanda Vander Ark and her eldest son, Paul Ferguson, discussing Timothy as if he were some kind of science experiment, planning his punishments, coordinating his torture. This is the story of Timothy Ferguson, a boy with autism and other special needs who should have been starting high school, making friends, discovering who he was. Instead, he spent the last year of his life in agony, betrayed by his own mother and brother. This is the story of Shanda Vander Ark, a woman who presented herself as a model citizen while committing acts of cruelty that defy comprehension. And this is a story about how a child can fall through every crack in a system designed to protect him, how warning signs can be ignored, how evil can hide behind a mask of respectability. Because what happened to Timothy Ferguson didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in secret, completely hidden from the world. People should have known something was wrong, but nobody stopped it. And by the time the truth finally came to light, it was far too late. Timothy Ferguson was born in 2007, with challenges that he never asked for. He came into this world with autism spectrum disorder, along with other developmental and behavioral challenges that would require patience, understanding, and specialized care. Timothy also had speech and motor impairments that made everyday tasks more difficult for him than for other children his age. But Timothy also came into this world with something else: a sweet disposition, a gentle nature, and a trust in the adults around him that would ultimately be his undoing. Those who knew Timothy before he went to live with his mother described him as a kind boy, someone who loved building with Legos, someone who just wanted to be accepted and loved like any other kid. At 15 years old, Timothy should have been navigating the typical challenges of adolescence. He should have been worried about homework and friendships, about fitting in, about all the normal anxieties that come with being a teenager. He should have been growing, developing, becoming whoever he was meant to be. Instead, Timothy spent his 15th year of life in a hell that most people couldn't imagine in their worst nightmares. Timothy's early years were spent primarily with his biological father, Eric Ferguson. Eric and Shanda had married young, and together they had 4 children. The marriage didn't last. Shanda and Eric divorced in January 2012, and in a move that would later seem ominous. Shanda voluntarily gave up her parental rights to all 4 of her children. She didn't fight for custody. She simply walked away, signing over full custody to Uruk. She was allowed only supervised visitation, 3 hours per month with her children. For years, Timothy lived without his mother in any meaningful capacity. He was raised by his father in Oklahoma, surrounded by his siblings, living a life that, while not perfect, was at least free from the torture that awaited him. But in May of 2021, everything changed. The exact circumstances of how Timothy came to live with Shanda remain somewhat unclear, though investigators believe Ark reached out to Shanda about Timothy's care. Timothy was struggling with his special needs, and perhaps Ark felt he needed additional support. By this time, Shanda had remarried. She was living in Michigan with her new husband, Adam Vander Ark, and her son Paul from her first marriage. She'd also had another child with Adam, a younger boy referred to in court documents only as G to protect his privacy. Shanda had attended law school and was working as a law clerk at the Nuga County Circuit Court. She presented herself as someone who had turned her life around, someone who was now stable and capable. She agreed to take Timothy. Looking back, knowing what we know now, it's impossible not to wonder what Ark was thinking when he sent his son to live with a woman who had voluntarily abandoned all her children years earlier. But hindsight is 2020, and at the time it probably seemed like a reasonable solution. Shanda was Timothy's mother. She was educated, employed, living in a nice home. She had resources. She told Ark she could handle Timothy's needs. She told him she wanted to be a mother to her son again. And so, in May of 2021, Timothy Ferguson moved into the house on Marshall Road in Norton Shores, Michigan. He had 14 months left to live. At first, things might have seemed okay. Timothy enrolled in school. He had a room. But slowly, methodically, Shanda Vander Ark began to isolate him. She pulled him out of school, claiming she would homeschool him instead. This removed Timothy from the watchful eyes of teachers, counselors, and other mandatory reporters who might have noticed signs of abuse. She began to convince Paul, her eldest son who also lived in the home, that Timothy was manipulative, that he was faking his disabilities, that he needed to be punished for his behaviors. Shanda worked to create a shared delusion between herself and Paul, a twisted worldview in which Timothy was the problem, a burden that needed to be managed, controlled, broken. She sent Paul articles about children who fake illnesses, about behavioral modification techniques. She told Paul that Timothy was going on hunger strikes, refusing to eat, and that they needed to teach him a lesson. She convinced Paul that everything they were about to do to Timothy was for his own good, that they were helping him, correcting him, making him better. The truth was, Timothy wasn't refusing to eat. He was being starved. The locks on the pantry and refrigerator, which appeared sometime around January 2022, ensured he had no access to food unless Shanda or Paul gave it to him. And what they gave him was barely enough to sustain life. Bread. Sometimes just bread soaked in hot sauce as a punishment. The surveillance cameras captured Timothy, desperate and emaciated, finding a discarded hamburger bun in the trash and eating it. When Shanda found out through the camera footage, she instructed Paul to make Timothy vomit it back up. A child, so hungry that he was eating garbage, was punished for trying to survive. Timothy's body began to waste away. The photos that would later be shown in court, the ones that made even his mother vomit when confronted with them, showed a boy who barely looked human anymore. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. His arms and legs were like twigs, all bone and skin with nothing in between. He looked like a victim of famine, of extreme deprivation. But this wasn't happening in a war zone or a poverty-stricken region. This was happening in Norton Shores, Michigan, in a middle-class home, perpetrated by a woman with legal training. Timothy had autism. He didn't fully understand why this was happening to him. He trusted his mother because that's what children do. They trust the adults who are supposed to care for them. Even as she hurt him, even as she starved him, even as she degraded and tortured him, some part of Timothy probably still believed that his mother loved him, that this would stop, that things would get better. But they never did. They only got worse. By the time Timothy died, he could no longer walk. His body didn't have the muscle mass or energy to support his weight. Shanda told Paul that Timothy was faking this, that he was being lazy, manipulative. She instructed Paul to force Timothy to stand, to drag him, to make him move even though his body was shutting down. The surveillance footage shows Timothy, a skeletal figure being pulled across floors, unable to support himself, suffering in ways that are almost impossible to watch. Timothy Ferguson should have had a life. He should have had birthdays and holidays, graduations and first dates, all the milestones that make up a human existence. He should have had people who protected him, who accommodated his special needs with patience and love. Instead, he had Shanda Vander Ark, and that meant he had no chance at all. Understanding how someone becomes capable of torturing their own child to death is perhaps an impossible task. We want there to be an explanation, some clear pathway that leads from normal human being to monster. But the truth is often more complex, more banal. Shanda Vander Ark didn't have a publicly known traumatic childhood that could explain her actions. She was, by most accounts, an ordinary woman who made extraordinary efforts to appear successful and in control, even as she committed unspeakable acts behind closed doors. Shanda was born and raised in Oklahoma. She married young to Paul Ferguson, and they had 4 children together: Nolan, Millie, Paul, and Timothy. On paper, it might have looked like a normal family, but something was deeply wrong. Shanda had interactions with Child Protective Services in Oklahoma, though the full details remain unclear. What is clear is that when she and Ark divorced in January 2012, she was embroiled in a bitter custody battle. And at some point during or after that battle, she made a choice that most parents would find unthinkable. She voluntarily relinquished her parental rights to all 4 of her children. She didn't fight for them. She simply left. This is significant. Most parents, even those who are struggling, even those who are overwhelmed, don't voluntarily give up their children. The parental bond is one of the strongest forces in nature. The fact that Shanda was able to walk away from 4 young children suggests a fundamental deficit in her capacity for maternal attachment, for empathy, for basic human connection. She was granted only 3 hours of supervised visitation per month, suggesting the court had concerns about her fitness as a parent. After leaving her first family, Shanda eventually moved to Michigan, where she married Adam Vander Ark, a man who would father her 5th child, the boy known as G. Shanda seemed determined to reinvent herself. She enrolled in law school, an ambitious undertaking for anyone, particularly for someone who had already walked away from one family. She worked hard, studied obsessively, and completed her legal education. Court records would later reveal that she missed only 1 question on the bar exam, demonstrating her intellectual capability and understanding of the legal system. She secured a position as a law clerk at the Naga County Circuit Court, working for 2 different judges over time. To the outside world, Shanda Vander Ark was a success story. A woman who had overcome whatever troubles plagued her first marriage, who had pursued higher education, who was working in the legal field and contributing to society. Her colleagues at the courthouse described her as professional, competent, reliable. They had no idea what she was going home to every night. They had no idea that the same woman who spent her days working in a building dedicated to justice was spending her nights orchestrating systematic torture. During the trial, Shanda would testify about her own struggles. She claimed she suffered from PTSD and reactive hypoglycemia, conditions she said made things difficult for her. Her defense attorney, Fred Johnson, would try to paint her as overwhelmed, as someone struggling with the challenges of raising a special needs child while working and dealing with her own health issues. But the evidence told a different story. The text messages between Shanda and Paul, thousands of them, showed a woman who was fully aware of what she was doing. They showed someone who planned punishments, who instructed her eldest son on exactly how to torture his younger brother, who monitored Timothy's suffering through cameras and discussed it casually, as if they were talking about training a pet rather than abusing a child. Shanda wasn't dissociated or confused. She was organized. She was methodical. She installed surveillance cameras throughout her home to watch Timothy's every move. She researched behavioral modification techniques. She coordinated with Paul, giving him specific instructions on when to give Timothy ice baths, how long to leave him in the cold water, what foods to withhold, how to punish him for infractions. This wasn't a woman who had lost control. This was a woman who was very much in control, who had decided that her disabled son was a problem to be managed through increasingly brutal means. There's a particular type of abuser who sees their children as extensions of themselves, as possessions rather than independent human beings. When the child doesn't live up to their expectations, when the child is difficult or requires extra care, they see it as a personal failure, an embarrassment. They resent the child for making them look bad, for not being easy. Based on the evidence presented at trial, many observers believe that Shanda fell into this category. Timothy's disabilities, his needs, they were inconvenient to her. They interfered with her image of herself as a successful law clerk, a woman who had it all together. So she tried to fix him, to break him down and rebuild him into something more manageable. And when that didn't work, when Timothy remained disabled no matter what she did to him, her frustration turned to cruelty, and cruelty turned to torture, and torture led inevitably to death. During her trial, when prosecutors showed Shanda photographs of Timothy's body, of what she had done to him, she vomited on the witness stand. Some saw this as evidence of remorse, a physical manifestation of guilt so overwhelming that her body couldn't contain it. But others interpreted it differently. Shanda wasn't upset about what she'd done. She was upset that she was being forced to confront it, to look at the evidence of her crime, to face the reality that she'd been denying. She was upset that she got caught. Judge Matthew Casel, who presided over her trial and ultimately sentenced her, seemed to agree with the latter interpretation. I've been trying now for this entire case to wrap my mind around how somebody could do something so horrific, he said from the bench, not only to another human being but to their own child. You intentionally and systematically tortured this child. Let's call it what it is. It's torture. You tortured this child. Shanda Vander Ark stood in that courtroom in her orange jail uniform, and when given the chance to speak, to explain herself, to show any kind of remorse, she simply shook her head no. She had nothing to say. No apologies, no explanations, no acknowledgement of the immense suffering she'd caused. Just silence. And perhaps that silence is the most honest thing she ever offered, because there are no words that could adequately explain what she did. There is no justification, no context that makes it understandable. Shanda Vander Ark tortured her child to death, and she did it knowingly, willingly, over an extended period of time. That's the truth. And it's a truth that's almost too terrible to accept. From the outside, the house on Marshall Road looked unremarkable. It was a standard two-story suburban home, the kind you'd find in any middle-class neighborhood across America. It had a lawn, a driveway, neighbors close by. It was the type of place where you'd expect to hear children playing, to see families coming and going, living ordinary lives. But inside those walls, something monstrous was taking place. Inside those walls, Timothy Ferguson was living through a nightmare that would eventually kill him. The first thing that struck investigators when they entered the home was the cameras. Security cameras were mounted everywhere, in nearly every room, covering multiple angles. This wasn't a simple home security system designed to protect against intruders. This was a surveillance network designed to monitor the people inside the house, specifically Timothy. Shanda Vander Ark wanted to see everything her son did every moment of every day. She wanted to catch him if he tried to sneak food, if he rested when he wasn't supposed to, if he did anything that violated the increasingly arbitrary rules she'd established. The footage from these cameras would become some of the most damning evidence in the case against Shanda and Paul. Hours upon hours of recordings showed Timothy's deterioration, his suffering, his desperate attempts to survive. They showed him finding scraps of food in the trash and eating them. They showed him being punished, restrained, abused. They showed a child in agony, and they showed the two people who should have protected him inflicting that agony instead. The kitchen told its own story. The pantry, which in any normal home would be accessible to family members, had a heavy padlock on it. The refrigerator was the same. Timothy was being prevented from accessing food in his own home. Imagine being a child, hungry, desperate, and knowing that just behind those locked doors is food, sustenance, relief, but you can't have it. Imagine that kind of psychological torture layered on top of the physical torture of starvation. When detectives inventoried the locked pantry, they found it well stocked. There was plenty of food in the house. This wasn't a situation where the family was struggling financially and couldn't afford to feed Timothy. The food was there. It was just being deliberately withheld from him. The cruelty of that, the calculated nature of it, is staggering. In the basement where Timothy had been forced to sleep, investigators found restraints, handcuffs, leg irons that had been ordered from Amazon using Shanda's account, zip ties. These weren't tools for safety or protection. These were instruments of torture used to keep a disabled child confined, controlled, dehumanized. They found the closet where Timothy had been made to sleep, a space so small that he couldn't stretch out, where he was kept in darkness, isolated, alone with his hunger and fear. The basement was cold. It was unfinished, concrete floors, exposed walls. It wasn't a place where you'd want to spend time, let alone sleep. And yet this is where Shanda had banished her son, away from the rest of the family, out of sight. There was a makeshift bathtub down there, and it was in this tub that Timothy's body would be found, soaked in ice water, his skin pale and cold, his body finally freed from the suffering that had consumed his last year of life. The home had been shared by Shanda, her husband Adam Vander Ark, Paul, Timothy, and the youngest child. Court documents are careful to protect G's identity, and rightly so. This child witnessed things no one should ever see. What kind of psychological impact does it have on a young person to watch their mother and older brother slowly torture and kill their other sibling? What kind of nightmares does that create? G was also living in this house of horrors, and while he wasn't the target of the abuse, he was certainly a victim of it in his own way. Adam Vander Ark's role in all of this remains somewhat unclear. He was living in the home during at least part of Timothy's time there. Court testimony and records suggest that Adam may have had his own health challenges, though the exact timeline is difficult to pin down with certainty. What is known is that Adam was not charged in connection with Timothy's death, suggesting that prosecutors either found no evidence of his involvement or determined he was unaware of the full extent of the abuse. Adam Vander Ark would pass away in February 2023, several months after Timothy's death, following a brief battle with leukemia. Whether he knew what was happening to Timothy, whether he could have intervened, these are questions that may never be fully answered. The neighbors didn't know what was happening inside that house, or if they suspected something, they didn't report it, or their reports didn't result in intervention. This is often the case in situations of hidden abuse. We want to believe that if something terrible is happening next door, we'd know, we'd see signs, we'd intervene. But abuse happens in plain sight all the time. It happens in nice neighborhoods, in homes that look normal, in families that seem functional from the outside. Timothy Ferguson was being tortured to death, and the people living 50 feet away had no idea. When Detective Stephanie Alm walked through that house, cataloging evidence, watching surveillance footage, reading text messages, she later described it as a house of horrors. Every room told a story of cruelty. Every piece of evidence revealed new depths of depravity. This wasn't just a case of neglect or even typical abuse. This was torture, pure and simple, and it had been going on for months, slowly escalating, Timothy's situation growing more desperate until finally, inevitably, his body gave out. The house on Marshall Road has likely changed hands by now, cleaned up, occupied by new residents who hopefully have no idea of its history. But for those who investigated Timothy's death, for those who sat through the trial and heard the evidence, that house will always be what it was in the summer of 2022. A chamber of horrors, a place where evil lived and a child died in the most terrible way imaginable. The torture of Timothy Ferguson didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual process, a slow escalation of cruelty that appears to have intensified significantly around January 2022. Understanding the full scope of what was done to this child requires walking through the specific methods Shanda and Paul used, the intentional, calculated ways they inflicted suffering. One of the primary torture methods was ice baths. This wasn't about hygiene or cleanliness. This was about punishment, about inflicting pain, about breaking Timothy's spirit and body. Paul Ferguson's testimony during the trial provided horrifying details about these ice baths. He described filling the bathtub with cold water and then adding bags and bags of ice. They would force Timothy into this freezing water and make him stay there for hours. Not minutes, hours. Hypothermia begins to set in when body temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Symptoms include shivering, confusion, loss of coordination, and eventually, if exposure continues, unconsciousness and death. Timothy was subjected to these ice baths repeatedly. His body, already weakened by starvation, had no defenses against the cold. He had no body fat to insulate him, no energy reserves to generate warmth. The ice baths weren't just painful, they were literally life-threatening every single time. Paul testified that the longest ice bath lasted approximately 9 hours, possibly even 9.5 hours according to some reports. 9 hours. Try to imagine sitting in ice water for even 10 minutes. The pain would be excruciating. Your body would be shaking uncontrollably. Your skin would turn blue. Your core temperature would drop dangerously. Now multiply that by 54. 9 hours of Timothy's already traumatized body being subjected to extreme cold, and he couldn't get out. He was trapped, forced to endure it, begging for relief that never came. According to testimony, Shanda told Paul that she was determined to outlast Timothy, to break his will completely. The starvation was just as methodical. Timothy wasn't simply not being fed enough. His access to food was completely controlled and deliberately restricted. Based on the timeline presented at trial, most investigators agree that the most severe food deprivation began around January 2022 and continued until Timothy's death in July. The locked pantry and refrigerator ensured he couldn't feed himself. When he was given food, it was minimal. Bread. Sometimes bread with hot sauce. Rice with hot sauce. The hot sauce wasn't for flavor. It was punishment, making even the small amount of food he received painful to consume. Text messages between Shanda and Paul discuss specific punishments involving hot sauce. Shanda instructed Paul to force-feed Timothy hot sauce with what she described as a severely painful burn as punishment for stealing food he didn't need. The implication that Timothy didn't need food, while he was literally starving to death, shows the depth of Shanda's delusion, or, more likely, her complete lack of empathy. She also suggested that Paul pour hot sauce on Timothy's genitals. Paul later testified that he refused to do this particular act, that there were some lines even he wouldn't cross. But the fact that Shanda suggested it, that she thought it was an appropriate punishment for a disabled child, speaks to her complete lack of humanity. The surveillance footage captured Timothy, skeletal and desperate, finding food in the trash and eating it. He was caught eating frozen chicken nuggets uncooked, so desperate for food that raw, frozen meat seemed like a feast. He ate an uncooked hamburger. This is what starvation does. It strips away dignity, pride, everything except the primal need to survive. Timothy was so hungry that garbage and raw food looked appealing. And when Shanda saw this on her cameras, she didn't feel compassion. She felt anger. She instructed Paul to make Timothy vomit up the food he'd eaten. A child, literally starving to death, was punished for trying to eat. Sleep deprivation was another tactic. Timothy wasn't allowed to sleep in a normal bedroom with a comfortable bed. He was confined to the basement, forced to sleep in a closet or in restraints. The basement had sensors and alarms installed to prevent Timothy from even going upstairs, turning his living space into a prison. The stress of constant hunger, cold, and fear would have made sleep difficult anyway, but Shanda made sure it was nearly impossible. Sleep deprivation is a recognized form of torture. used by interrogators and abusers because it breaks down cognitive function, emotional regulation, and physical health. It makes people confused, paranoid, unable to think clearly. And Timothy was a child with autism and other developmental challenges, conditions that already made regulation difficult. Depriving him of sleep was particularly cruel given his vulnerabilities. The physical restraints turned Timothy into a prisoner in his own home. Handcuffs kept his hands bound. Leg irons, heavy metal shackles purchased on Amazon, restricted his movement. Zip ties were used to secure him in various positions. Paul testified about dragging Timothy, forcing him to move even when his body had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer walk on his own. The video footage shows this. A child who is literally too weak to support his own weight being pulled across floors, his body limp, completely at the mercy of people who had none. Shanda told Paul, and apparently convinced herself, that Timothy was faking his inability to walk. She and Paul both dismissed the shaking and struggling to walk as symptoms that were fake, that Timothy was manipulating them. She believed, or claimed to believe, that if they just pushed him hard enough, he'd get up and walk normally. This delusion, this could imply either genuine mental illness or deliberate cruelty disguised as concern, allowed her to justify the abuse. In her mind, she wasn't torturing a disabled child who was dying of starvation. She was correcting a manipulative teenager who was trying to get out of responsibilities. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this belief while watching Timothy waste away is almost incomprehensible. But perhaps the most insidious form of torture was the psychological abuse. Timothy knew his mother was supposed to love him. Children are hardwired to seek approval and affection from their parents, and Shanda used this, weaponized it. She made Timothy believe that the torture was his fault, that he was being punished because he was bad, because he wasn't trying hard enough. She destroyed his sense of self-worth, made him believe he deserved the suffering. This kind of psychological manipulation, especially against a child with developmental disabilities who might not fully understand what was happening, is profoundly damaging. Dr. Joyce DeJong, the medical examiner who performed Timothy's autopsy, testified about the state of his body when he died. He weighed 69 pounds. He had no subcutaneous fat. His muscle tissue had been consumed by his body in a desperate attempt to stay alive. His organs were shutting down. Ligaments were detaching from bones. His body was, in Dr. DeJong's words, breaking down. The cause of death was listed as malnutrition and dehydration, with hypothermia as a contributing factor. The manner of death was homicide. Timothy Ferguson didn't die in an accident. He didn't die from an illness or a condition beyond anyone's control. He died because his mother and brother systematically tortured him over the course of months, starving him, freezing him, degrading him, until his 15-year-old body simply couldn't survive anymore. And they documented it all. The cameras captured it. The text messages discussed it. The evidence of Timothy's torture and death was overwhelming, undeniable, a digital record of systematic cruelty that would ultimately send both Shanda and Paul to prison for the rest of their lives. Understanding Paul Ferguson's role in Timothy's death is complicated. He was 20 years old when the abuse was happening, legally an adult, capable of making his own decisions. And yet, he was also Shanda's son, someone who had been under her influence his entire life. The question that haunted the trial, that haunts everyone who learns about this case, is how much responsibility does Paul bear? Was he a victim of his mother's manipulation, or was he an equal participant in the torture of his younger brother? The evidence suggests the answer is somewhere in the middle, and that middle ground offers no comfort. Paul wasn't forced to abuse Timothy at gunpoint. He wasn't under duress in the traditional sense, but he was under the psychological control of a woman who had spent his entire life shaping his worldview, and who specifically worked to convince him that Timothy was faking, manipulating, deserving of punishment. The text messages between Shanda and Paul are particularly revealing. They show a relationship where Shanda gave instructions and Paul, for the most part, followed them. She would text him about giving Timothy ice baths, about restricting his food, about specific punishments. And Paul would comply. But the messages also show Paul questioning things sometimes, expressing discomfort, and Shanda would reassure him, redirect him, convince him that what they were doing was necessary. One particularly disturbing set of messages involved Shanda instructing Paul to taunt Timothy with food. She told Paul to eat a frozen pizza roll in front of Timothy, to show him the food he wasn't allowed to have, to psychologically torture him with the sight and smell of something he was desperately craving. Paul did this. He testified to it in court. He stood in front of his starving brother and ate food while Timothy watched, unable to have any himself. The cruelty of this act, the deliberate nature of it, is stomach-turning. Shanda also sent Paul messages suggesting he pour hot sauce on Timothy's genitals. Paul testified that he refused to do this, that there were some lines even he wouldn't cross. Prosecutors argued that this refusal showed Paul had moral agency, that he was capable of saying no to his mother, which meant he was capable of saying no to all of it. He chose not to. Defense attorneys would later argue that Paul saying no to one specific act, while complying with hundreds of others, actually demonstrated how powerful his mother's influence was. That the fact he was able to refuse one thing out of many showed how completely she controlled him the rest of the time. During the trial, Paul took the stand and testified against his mother. This was part of a plea deal he'd struck with prosecutors. In exchange for his testimony, Paul pleaded guilty to first-degree child abuse and would face sentencing separately. His testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. He provided details that only someone who had been there could know. He explained the punishments, the ice baths, the starvation. He read text messages aloud in court. He admitted to his role in Timothy's death. But his testimony was also painful to watch. Paul seemed, at times, like he was still trying to process what he'd done. He cried on the stand. He said things like, "I suppose I didn't love him enough," a statement that suggests some awareness of his failure, some recognition that he should have protected Timothy instead of hurting him. But awareness after the fact doesn't undo the harm. Timothy is still dead, and Paul's hands are still covered in his blood. The question of whether Paul was manipulated by his mother became central to his own sentencing hearing. His attorneys argued that he was, essentially, a victim himself, that Shanda had groomed him from childhood to obey her, to believe her version of reality, to do what she said without question. They pointed to the power dynamic between a mother and son, the psychological control that can exist in those relationships, especially when the mother is as forceful and manipulative as Shanda Vander Ark. Prosecutors disagreed. They argued that Paul was a grown man, that he had opportunities to stop the abuse, to call the police, to protect his brother. They pointed out that Paul had access to the internet, to information about abuse and how to report it. He knew what they were doing was wrong. The fact that he did it anyway, that he participated fully and willingly for months, made him just as culpable as his mother. On February 26, 2024, Paul Ferguson was sentenced. Judge Matthew Casel, the same judge who had sentenced Shanda, presided over the hearing, and his words were harsh. "You are just as bad, if not worse, than your mother," the judge said. He noted that Paul presented a significant danger to the public. The judge sentenced Paul to 30 to 100 years in prison for first-degree child abuse. 30 to 100 years. It's a sentence that ensures Paul will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. He'll be eligible for parole after 30 years, which would make him 50 years old. But given the nature of his crime, given what he did to his defenseless disabled brother, parole seems unlikely. Paul Ferguson will grow old in prison, and perhaps that's justice. Or perhaps justice for Timothy Ferguson is impossible because nothing can bring him back. Nothing can undo the suffering he endured. Paul's sentencing brought some measure of closure to Timothy's other siblings. Norton Ferguson, one of Timothy's older brothers who hadn't lived with Shanda, spoke at both Shanda's and Paul's sentencing hearings. His statements were powerful, filled with grief and rage. He talked about Timothy, about the brother he'd lost, about the fact that their own mother and brother had killed him. "If I can't have my brother back," Nolan said, "then they shouldn't have their freedom back." Timothy's sister Millie also provided a victim impact statement at Shanda's sentencing, though the specific details of her statement were not widely reported. The siblings who survived, who didn't live in that house of horrors, were left to process an impossible loss and an unthinkable betrayal. The tragedy of Paul Ferguson is that he was both perpetrator and, in some ways, a product of Shanda's manipulations. But that tragedy doesn't absolve him. Timothy was the real victim. Timothy was the one who suffered. Timothy was the one who died. And Paul, whatever his motivations, whatever psychological control his mother had over him, was one of the people who inflicted that suffering. He had choices. He made the wrong ones. And now he'll spend the rest of his life paying for those choices, living with the knowledge of what he did to his own brother. In many criminal cases, the challenge for prosecutors is proving what happened beyond a reasonable doubt. Witnesses can be unreliable, memories fade, physical evidence can be ambiguous. But in the case against Shanda Vander Ark, there was no such difficulty. The evidence was overwhelming, detailed, and damning, because Shanda herself had created a comprehensive record of her crimes. The surveillance cameras she'd installed to monitor Timothy captured hours upon hours of his abuse. And the text messages between her and Paul provided a written confession, a play-by-play of the torture they inflicted. These text messages, entered into evidence and read aloud during the trial, offer a window into Shanda's mind that is absolutely chilling. They show someone who saw her disabled son not as a child needing care, but as a problem to be solved through increasingly brutal means. They show planning, premeditation, a systematic approach to abuse, and they show an utter lack of empathy or remorse. In one exchange, Shanda instructed Paul on how long to keep Timothy in an ice bath. She specified times, details, exactly how it should be done. She wasn't figuring this out in the moment, acting on impulse or emotion. She was methodical, treating the torture of her son like a task to be managed, a project to be executed properly. In another set of messages, Shanda and Paul discussed whether Timothy was faking his inability to walk. Shanda insisted he was manipulating them, that he could walk if he wanted to but was choosing not to in order to get sympathy or avoid responsibilities. She sent Paul articles about children who fake illnesses, trying to convince him that Timothy was doing the same thing. Paul, influenced by his mother, seemed to accept this narrative, at least in the messages. They discussed forcing Timothy to stand, to move, to prove he could do it. The reality, of course, was that Timothy couldn't walk because he was starving to death. His body had consumed its own muscle tissue. He was too weak to support his weight. The medical examiner would later confirm this. But Shanda and Paul had convinced themselves, or at least Shanda had convinced Paul, that it was all an act. This delusion allowed them to justify the abuse, to see Timothy's suffering as self-inflicted, as a manipulation tactic rather than a genuine medical emergency. One of the most disturbing text exchanges involved food. Shanda told Paul to eat a frozen pizza roll in front of Timothy, to make him watch as Paul enjoyed food that Timothy was being denied. This wasn't about nutrition or discipline. This was psychological torture, designed to inflict emotional pain on top of the physical pain of starvation. And Paul did it. He texted back confirming that he'd followed his mother's instructions, that he'd taunted his starving brother with food. Another message showed Shanda instructing Paul to force-feed Timothy hot sauce, with a severely painful burn as punishment for stealing food he didn't need. Another showed her suggesting that Paul pour hot sauce on Timothy's genitals as punishment. The specific infraction that would warrant such a punishment was never made clear, but that's because there is no infraction that would justify such an act. This was sadism, pure and simple, a suggestion to inflict pain and humiliation on a vulnerable child. Paul testified that he didn't do this particular thing, that he refused, but the fact that Shanda suggested it tells us everything we need to know about her mindset. The text messages also revealed Shanda's paranoia about being caught. She instructed Paul to be careful about what he said and to whom. She seemed aware that what they were doing was wrong, that if authorities found out there would be consequences. But instead of stopping the abuse, she focused on hiding it better. She didn't care about Timothy's well-being. She cared about not getting caught. The surveillance footage was, if possible, even more damning than the text messages. Hours upon hours of recordings showed Timothy's physical deterioration over time. Early footage from when he first came to live with Shanda showed a boy who, while thin, was still recognizable as a teenager. Later footage showed a skeletal figure, a child who looked like he was dying because he was. The progression was stark, undeniable proof that Timothy hadn't died suddenly or unexpectedly. His death was the result of prolonged abuse, visible in real time through Shanda's own cameras. The footage showed Timothy in restraints, handcuffed, shackled, unable to move freely. It showed him searching for food, finding scraps in the trash, eating them desperately. It showed him eating frozen chicken nuggets uncooked, eating an uncooked hamburger so desperate that raw food seemed like salvation. It showed him being forced into ice baths, his body shaking, his lips turning blue. It showed him collapsing, unable to stand, being dragged by Paul. It showed suffering that is almost unwatchable, and it showed the two people who were supposed to care for Timothy inflicting that suffering deliberately. During the trial, prosecutors played some of this footage for the jury. It's not clear exactly what clips were shown. Many were likely too disturbing to present in full. But even edited versions were enough to make seasoned court observers visibly upset. Jurors cried. Observers in the gallery had to leave the room. And when Shanda herself was shown photographs of Timothy's body, of the condition he was in when he died, she vomited on the witness stand. Some interpreted this physical reaction as a sign of remorse, as Shanda's body rejecting the reality of what she'd done. But prosecutors suggested it was something else entirely. Shanda wasn't upset about Timothy's death. She was upset that she had to look at it, had to confront it in front of all these people, had to face the undeniable evidence of her crime. She'd managed to compartmentalize while it was happening, to convince herself that what she was doing was justified or necessary. But confronted with the physical reality, with the photographic proof of her son's torture and death, her body rebelled. The digital evidence in this case left no room for doubt, no space for reasonable arguments about what had happened or who was responsible. Shanda Vander Ark had tortured her son to death. Paul had helped her, and they documented the entire process themselves. The cameras and text messages that Shanda had used to control and monitor Timothy became the very tools that ensured she would be held accountable for what she'd done. Justice for Timothy would have been preventing his death in the first place, but failing that, at least the evidence ensured his killers wouldn't escape punishment. The last days of Timothy Ferguson's life were filled with suffering that most of us cannot even begin to comprehend. By early July 2022, Timothy had been living with Shanda for over a year, and the systematic abuse had taken a catastrophic toll. He weighed only 69 pounds. He couldn't walk. His body was shutting down, and still, the torture continued. The exact timeline of Timothy's final hours is difficult to piece together completely, but testimony and evidence from the trial provide a general picture. On the night of July 5th, going into the early morning of July 6th, Timothy was subjected to another ice bath. Based on what we know from court testimony, this one lasted approximately 9 hours, possibly even 9.5 hours. 9 hours of a severely malnourished, hypothermic child being kept in freezing water. Imagine Timothy's experience. He's already in constant pain from starvation, his stomach cramping, his head pounding. He's weak, barely able to move on his own, and then he's placed into ice water. Within minutes, his body temperature starts to drop. He starts shivering uncontrollably, his body's desperate attempt to generate warmth. But he has no body fat to insulate him, no energy reserves to fuel that warming process. The shivering would eventually stop, not because he's warming up, but because his body doesn't have the energy to continue. As hours pass, Timothy's core temperature continues to fall. He's experiencing hypothermia, which causes confusion, drowsiness, loss of coordination. He might have been begging to get out, or he might have been past the point of being able to speak. His lips would have turned blue, his skin pale and cold to the touch. His heart rate would have slowed. His breathing would have become shallow. He was, quite literally, dying in that ice bath. At some point, Timothy was removed from the water. It's not clear exactly when or why. Perhaps even Shanda realized things had gone too far. Perhaps Timothy had lost consciousness. What is clear is that when he was found on the morning of July 6th, he was dead and his body was in the basement, still wet, still cold. Paul Ferguson made the 911 call at approximately 7:53 in the morning. His voice on the recording is eerily calm, almost mechanical. He reported that his brother Timothy had fallen from his bunk bed and was dead. This was the story they'd apparently agreed upon, the lie they would tell to explain Timothy's death. A tragic accident, a fall, unfortunate but not criminal. But that story fell apart almost immediately. When Officer Sean Stephanish arrived and saw Timothy's body, he knew this was no accident. The severe emaciation, the bruising, the evidence of prolonged abuse, it was all immediately apparent. Timothy's body told the truth that Shanda and Paul's words tried to hide. Shanda stuck to the story initially. Timothy had been difficult, she said. He'd been refusing to eat, going on hunger strikes. He'd fallen from his bed. These things happen with special needs children, she implied. She used her knowledge of the legal system, her experience as a law clerk, to try to control the narrative. She spoke with confidence, with the language of someone accustomed to being believed. But Detective Stephanie Alm wasn't buying it. She'd seen child abuse cases before, and this was one of the worst. The more she investigated, the more evidence she uncovered, the clearer it became that Timothy's death was anything but an accident. The surveillance footage, the text messages, the locked pantry and refrigerator, the restraints in the basement, it all painted a picture of systematic torture culminating in death. Within a day, Shanda was arrested. Paul was arrested shortly after. They were both charged initially, with charges that would eventually be expanded as the full scope of the abuse became known. And the community of Norton Shores, a quiet suburban area where these kinds of things aren't supposed to happen, was left reeling. Timothy's death made local news, then national news. People were horrified. How could a mother do this to her child? How could it go on for so long without anyone noticing? Where were the safeguards, the systems designed to protect vulnerable children? These were questions without easy answers. In Timothy's last moments, he was likely alone in that basement, his body finally giving out after months of torture. He died without comfort, without love, without anyone telling him it wasn't his fault, that he deserved better, that he was worthy of care and kindness. He died believing, perhaps, that he had somehow brought this on himself. That's one of the cruelest aspects of what Shanda and Paul did. They didn't just kill Timothy's body. They killed his spirit first, made him believe he was worthless, undeserving of basic human decency. Timothy Ferguson was 15 years old. He should have had decades of life ahead of him. Instead, he got 14 months of hell followed by death in a cold basement, his body broken, his spirit crushed, alone except for the two people who had destroyed him. Detective Stephanie Alm had worked child abuse cases before. In her years with law enforcement, she'd seen neglect, physical abuse, situations that made her question humanity. But when she walked into the house on Marshall Road and began her investigation into Timothy Ferguson's death, she knew immediately that this case was different. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't a parent who lost their temper. This was systematic, intentional, prolonged torture. The initial scene told her everything she needed to know. Timothy's body, weighing only 69 pounds, showed signs of severe malnutrition, dehydration, and hypothermia. In July, in Michigan's summer, for a child to show signs of hypothermia in the middle of summer meant something deeply wrong had happened. The medical examiner would later confirm what Alm already suspected. Timothy had been subjected to ice baths, prolonged exposure to freezing water that had contributed to his death. But Alm needed more than suspicion. She needed evidence. And Shanda Vander Ark, perhaps believing her legal training made her smarter than the average suspect, had helpfully provided mountains of it. The search of the home revealed the surveillance system first. Cameras everywhere, all connected to a central recording system. Alm obtained warrants to seize the recordings, and what she found on those videos was nothing short of a documentary of child torture. Hours and hours of footage showing Timothy's deterioration, his desperation, his suffering. The videos showed him searching for food, eating garbage, being restrained, being forced into ice baths. They showed a timeline of abuse that spanned months. Then there were the text messages. Alm obtained warrants for Shanda and Paul's phones, and the messages between mother and son provided a written record of their crimes. They discussed Timothy as if he were an object, not a person. They planned punishments with clinical detachment. They coordinated schedules for torture. And they convinced each other that Timothy was manipulating them, that everything they were doing was justified. The locked pantry and refrigerator were photographed and documented. The restraints, handcuffs, leg irons, zip ties, all were collected as evidence. Amazon records showed that Shanda had purchased many of these items, creating a paper trail that connected her directly to the instruments of Timothy's torture. Alm interviewed Paul separately from Shanda. Initially, he tried to stick to the story about Timothy falling from his bunk bed, but when confronted with the evidence, with the videos and text messages and physical condition of Timothy's body, Paul began to crack. He admitted to the ice baths. He admitted to restricting Timothy's food. He admitted to dragging Timothy across floors, to restraining him, to following his mother's instructions even when he knew they were hurting his brother. Paul's interrogation was crucial. Without his testimony, prosecutors would have had a strong case based on physical evidence alone. But with Paul willing to testify against his mother, willing to provide details that only someone present could know, the case became airtight. Shanda's interrogation was different. She was calm, collected, using her knowledge of the legal system to her advantage. She asked for a lawyer almost immediately. She understood her rights, understood how investigations worked. She gave minimal information, stuck to her story about Timothy being difficult and refusing to eat. She portrayed herself as a struggling mother doing her best with a challenging child. But the evidence didn't support her narrative. Dr. Joyce DeJong, the Muskegon County medical examiner, performed Timothy's autopsy, and her findings were damning. Timothy hadn't died from a fall. He died from malnutrition and dehydration, with hypothermia as a contributing factor. His body showed signs of prolonged starvation. His organs were failing. His muscle tissue had been consumed by his own body. This wasn't a child who had been refusing to eat. This was a child who had been denied food for so long that his body had begun to cannibalize itself. DeJong's testimony would later become one of the most powerful moments in the trial. She described Timothy's body in clinical terms, but the emotion in her voice was unmistakable. This was a child who had suffered immensely. This was a child who had been tortured to death, and the evidence was irrefutable. Alm also discovered that Timothy had been pulled out of school. Shanda had claimed she was homeschooling him, but there was no evidence of any educational activity. Timothy wasn't being homeschooled. He was being isolated, cut off from teachers and counselors and other adults who might have noticed the abuse and reported it. This isolation was deliberate, a way to ensure that Timothy's suffering remained hidden. The investigation also revealed financial records showing that Shanda had ordered the leg irons and other restraints online. She'd researched behavioral modification techniques. She'd planned this abuse, thought about it, prepared for it. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a parent who snapped under pressure. This was premeditated torture. As Alm built her case, she consulted with prosecutors. The Muskegon County Prosecutor's Office assigned the case to their team, and together they began constructing the strongest possible charges. Shanda would be charged with felony murder and first-degree child abuse. Paul would face similar charges, though prosecutors were willing to offer him a deal in exchange for his testimony against his mother. The investigation took months. Every piece of evidence had to be cataloged, analyzed, prepared for trial. The surveillance footage had to be reviewed, specific clips identified that would be shown to a jury. The text messages had to be organized chronologically, showing the progression of the abuse. Medical experts had to be consulted, reports written, testimony prepared. Throughout it all, Alm never lost sight of the victim at the center of this case. Timothy Ferguson, a 15-year-old boy with special needs who deserved protection and care. A child who had been betrayed by the people who should have loved him most. Alm was determined to get justice for Timothy, to make sure that Shanda and Paul paid for what they'd done. By the time the case went to trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors had surveillance footage, text messages, medical examiner testimony, Paul's confession and cooperation, physical evidence from the home, and expert testimony about the nature and extent of Timothy's suffering. Shanda Vander Ark might have had legal training, might have thought she was smart enough to get away with murder, but she'd made one critical mistake. She documented everything. And those documents would be her undoing. The trial of Shanda Vander Ark began on December 11, 2023, more than a year after Timothy Ferguson's death. The courtroom in Muskegon County was packed with observers, media, and Timothy's family members who had come to see justice served. Shanda entered the courtroom in an orange jail jumpsuit, her demeanor calm and composed, the same carefully controlled mask she'd worn since her arrest. The prosecution, led by Assistant Prosecuting Attorney Matt Roberts, laid out their case methodically. In opening statements, Roberts told the jury exactly what they were about to hear: a story of systematic torture, of a mother who starved and froze her disabled son to death, who manipulated her older son into helping her, who treated Timothy not as a child to be loved but as a problem to be eliminated. Roberts explained that the evidence would be difficult to hear, difficult to see, but necessary to understand the full scope of what had been done to Timothy. He warned the jury about the surveillance footage they would see, the photographs of Timothy's emaciated body, the text messages discussing his torture as casually as someone might discuss grocery shopping. The defense attorney, Fred Johnson, tried a different approach. He didn't deny that Timothy had died under Shanda's care. He didn't deny that the conditions in the home were horrific. Instead, he tried to argue that Shanda hadn't intended to kill Timothy, that she was overwhelmed, mentally unwell, unable to recognize how serious Timothy's condition had become. Johnson told the jury that they were looking at someone who was sick, not evil, that this was a case of a tragic failure, not premeditated murder. But the evidence told a different story. The prosecution called witness after witness, building their case piece by piece. Officer Sean Stephanish testified about arriving at the scene, about seeing Timothy's body and immediately knowing this was no accident. His voice broke as he described the condition of the 15-year-old boy, the emaciation, the bruising, the clear signs of prolonged abuse. Dr. Joyce DeJong, the medical examiner, provided crucial testimony. She explained the autopsy findings in detail. Timothy weighed 69 pounds at death. His body had no subcutaneous fat. His muscle tissue had been consumed. His organs showed signs of failure. He had ligaments detaching from bones. The cause of death was malnutrition and dehydration, with hypothermia as a contributing factor. DeJong testified that Timothy had been starving for an extended period, that this wasn't sudden or unexpected, that he had suffered tremendously before he died. Then came Paul Ferguson's testimony, and this was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Paul had taken a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against his mother, he would plead guilty to first-degree child abuse and face sentencing after Shanda's trial. He took the stand dressed in jail clothing, his eyes downcast, and began to describe in detail what had been done to Timothy. Paul testified about the ice baths, about filling the tub with cold water and bags of ice, about forcing Timothy to stay in the freezing water for hours. He described the longest bath, the one that lasted approximately 9 hours, the one that likely killed Timothy. He testified about restricting Timothy's food, about the locked pantry and refrigerator, about giving Timothy only bread and sometimes bread soaked in hot sauce. He described following his mother's instructions to eat food in front of Timothy, taunting his starving brother with the sight and smell of things he wasn't allowed to have. He testified about the text messages, about his mother sending him articles claiming Timothy was faking his disabilities, about being convinced that they were correcting Timothy's behavior rather than torturing him. Paul's testimony was difficult to watch. He cried on the stand. He admitted that he knew what they were doing was wrong, that he should have stopped it, should have called the police, should have protected Timothy. "I suppose I didn't love him enough," he said at one point, a statement that hung in the air, an admission of failure that couldn't undo the harm. The prosecution played clips from the surveillance footage. The courtroom fell silent as jurors watched Timothy, skeletal and desperate, searching for food in the trash. They watched him eating a discarded hamburger bun, the desperation of a child literally starving to death. They watched him in restraints, unable to move, his body barely more than bones. They watched him being forced into ice baths, watched his body shaking from the cold. Several jurors were seen wiping tears. Observers in the gallery had to leave. Even seasoned court reporters, people accustomed to hearing and seeing terrible things, struggled with the footage. This wasn't just evidence of a crime. This was a window into suffering so profound, so intentional that it challenged the very notion of human decency. The prosecution presented the text messages between Shanda and Paul. Roberts read some of them aloud, his voice flat and clinical, letting the words speak for themselves. Messages discussing ice baths and their duration. Messages about food restriction. Messages about forcing Timothy to vomit up food he'd found in the trash. Messages suggesting hot sauce be poured on Timothy's genitals as punishment. Each message was damning on its own. Together, they created an irrefutable record of premeditation, of planning, of systematic abuse carried out over months. Shanda hadn't lost control. She hadn't acted on impulse. She had carefully, methodically tortured her son to death, and she documented the entire process. The defense called few witnesses. Their strategy seemed to rest on the idea that Shanda's mental state excused her actions, that she genuinely didn't understand what she was doing. But this argument was undermined by the evidence. The text messages showed someone who was lucid, organized, capable of planning and coordination. The surveillance system showed someone paranoid about being caught, aware that what she was doing was wrong. And then Shanda herself took the stand, and the trial took a dramatic turn. Shanda testified in her own defense, attempting to explain her actions. She claimed she had gaps in her memory, that she couldn't remember many of the events Paul described. She said Timothy had been difficult, that he'd been refusing to eat, that she'd been doing her best in an impossible situation. She testified about her own health issues, including PTSD and reactive hypoglycemia. She tried to portray herself as overwhelmed, as someone who had made mistakes but hadn't intended to kill her son. But the prosecution was ready. Matt Roberts cross-examined Shanda, confronting her with the evidence. He showed her the text messages she'd sent to Paul. He asked her to explain specific instructions she'd given. He showed her photographs of Timothy's body. And that's when Shanda vomited on the witness stand. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Shanda was taken from the stand, visibly ill, unable to continue. Some interpreted this as a sign of genuine remorse, her body physically rejecting the reality of what she'd done. But others saw it differently. Shanda had been able to torture Timothy, to watch him suffer for months, to see his body waste away. She'd only gotten sick when confronted with photographic evidence in front of a jury, when forced to acknowledge her crimes publicly. After a break, Shanda didn't return to the courtroom for the remainder of the trial. Her attorney informed the judge that Shanda was experiencing a significant downturn in her mental health and wouldn't be present. She waived her right to be present, a decision that would later become part of her appeal strategy. The trial continued without her. Closing arguments were delivered on December 14th. Roberts, for the prosecution, reminded the jury of everything they'd heard and seen. The surveillance footage showing Timothy's suffering, the text messages planning that suffering, the medical examiner's testimony about the torture Timothy's body had endured. "See, dummy, you don't need to open your mouth to breathe," Roberts said, quoting one of Shanda's text messages to Paul, a cruel taunt that exemplified her complete lack of empathy for her dying son. Fred Johnson, for the defense, argued that Shanda hadn't committed murder, that she'd caused Timothy's death but hadn't intended to. He asked the jury to consider her mental state, her circumstances, the challenges of raising a special needs child. He portrayed her as sick, not evil. But the jury didn't buy it. After deliberating for just over 1 hour, they returned with their verdict on December 15, 2023, guilty of felony murder and guilty of first-degree child abuse. Shanda Vander Ark had tortured her son to death, and a jury of her peers had held her accountable. Timothy's family members, who had sat through days of testimony hearing about his suffering, wept openly. Justice, at least in legal terms, had been served, but no verdict could bring Timothy back. No conviction could undo the months of torture he'd endured. The trial had exposed the truth, had ensured Shanda would be punished, but it couldn't heal the fundamental wound of Timothy's death. On January 23, 2024, Shanda Vander Ark stood before Judge Matthew Casel for sentencing. The courtroom was once again packed, filled with family members, victims' advocates, media, and members of the public who wanted to see justice delivered for Timothy Ferguson. Shanda wore an orange jail jumpsuit, her expression blank, her demeanor unchanged from throughout the trial. Before the judge imposed sentence, he heard victim impact statements. Timothy's older brother, Norton Ferguson, spoke first. Norton hadn't lived with Shanda, hadn't been part of the household where Timothy died, but he'd lost a brother, and his grief was palpable. Norton stood at the podium, his voice steady but filled with emotion, and he spoke directly to the woman who had given birth to him and his brothers. "You're not my mother," he said. "A mother doesn't do what you did. A mother doesn't torture her child to death." He talked about Timothy, about the gentle, kind boy who deserved so much better than the hand life dealt him. He talked about the last time he'd seen Timothy, not knowing it would be the last time, not knowing what was happening to his brother in that house on Marshall Road. "If I can't have my brother back," Norton said, his voice breaking, "then you shouldn't have your freedom back." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of impossible grief, of a loss that could never be made right. Timothy's sister Millie also provided a victim impact statement, describing her brother and the impact his loss had on the family. The siblings who survived, who didn't live in that house of horrors, were left to process an impossible loss and an unthinkable betrayal. The victim impact statements painted a picture of Timothy as a real person, not just a victim in a case file. A boy who loved Legos and building things, with people who loved him, with a life that mattered. Shanda sat through these statements showing no visible emotion, the same blank expression she'd worn throughout the trial. Then it was Judge Casel's turn to speak, and his words were scathing. "I've been sitting on the bench now for several years," Casel began, "and I've been trying now for this entire case to wrap my mind around how somebody could do something so horrific, not only to another human being but to their own child." He paused, looking directly at Shanda. "You intentionally and systematically tortured this child. Let's call it what it is. It's torture. You tortured this child." Casel went through the evidence, reminding everyone in the courtroom of what had been done to Timothy. The starvation that reduced a teenage boy to 69 pounds. The ice baths that lasted for hours, with the final one lasting 9 hours and likely causing Timothy's death. The restraints, the isolation, the psychological abuse layered on top of the physical torture. The amount of torture that I have indicated justifies reasonable grounds to depart from the guidelines, Casel said, explaining that he would be sentencing Shanda above what sentencing guidelines suggested. This was an exceptional case that warranted exceptional punishment. For the charge of first-degree child abuse, Judge Casel sentenced Shanda Vander Ark to 50 to 100 years in prison. For the felony murder charge, he sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentences would run consecutively, meaning even if by some miracle she became eligible for parole on the child abuse charge after 50 years, she would still be serving a life sentence for murder. Life without parole. It meant Shanda Vander Ark, 43 years old at sentencing, would spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. She would die in prison. She would never know freedom again, and Judge Casel made it clear that this was exactly what she deserved. When given the opportunity to speak, to show remorse, to explain herself, to apologize to her family and the memory of her son, Shanda shook her head. She had nothing to say. No apologies, no explanations, no acknowledgement of the suffering she'd caused. Just silence. That silence spoke volumes. Even faced with a life sentence, even confronted with the full weight of her crimes, Shanda Vander Ark had nothing to offer. No remorse, no regret, no human emotion at all. It was, in its own way, the most damning evidence of her character. 2 months later, on February 26, 2024, Paul Ferguson was sentenced for his role in Timothy's death. He appeared before Judge Casel having already pleaded guilty to first-degree child abuse. His testimony against his mother had been crucial to her conviction, and prosecutors had acknowledged his cooperation. But Judge Casel wasn't feeling merciful. "You are just as bad, if not worse, than your mother," the judge told Paul. He noted that Paul had been there in the home, watching Timothy suffer every single day. He'd had countless opportunities to stop it, to call the police, to protect his vulnerable younger brother. Instead, he'd participated in the torture, had followed his mother's instructions, had taunted Timothy with food while his brother starved. "You present a significant danger to the public," Casel said. He sentenced Paul Ferguson to 30 to 100 years in prison, a sentence that effectively meant Paul, like his mother, would likely die behind bars. Paul would be eligible for parole after 30 years, which would make him 50 years old. But given the nature of his crime, parole seemed unlikely. The parole board would have to look at what he did, systematically torturing his disabled brother to death, and decide he was safe to release into society. That seemed improbable at best. Both Shanda and Paul were taken from the courtroom in handcuffs, led back to jail cells where they would spend the rest of their lives. The sentences brought some measure of closure to Timothy's family. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served. The people responsible for Timothy's death would be punished, would never be free again. But as Nolan had said in his victim impact statement, no sentence could bring Timothy back. No punishment could undo the suffering he'd endured. The best that could be achieved was ensuring that Shanda and Paul couldn't hurt anyone else, that they would pay for their crimes for the rest of their lives. And that, at least, had been accomplished. In the months and years following Shanda Vander Ark's conviction and sentencing, the case continued to reverberate. It became a national story, covered by major news outlets and true crime media. People were horrified, fascinated in that dark way humans have with the worst examples of our species. How could a mother do this? How could a brother participate? How could it go on for so long without anyone intervening? The questions are easier to ask than to answer. Shanda didn't give up after her sentencing. In July 2025, she appeared in court attempting to appeal her conviction, her attorneys arguing that she should be granted a new trial. The basis of the appeal was that Shanda had been mentally incompetent during her original trial, unable to participate in her own defense. Her attorney, Ronald Ambrose, claimed that Shanda had experienced a significant downturn in her mental health, during the trial that she'd been in a catatonic state and that the trial should have been suspended for a mental health evaluation. Prosecutors countered that this was, essentially, a manipulation tactic. They characterized Shanda's behavior as a feigned bout of incompetence designed to undermine the jury verdict. They pointed to her legal training, her education, her clear understanding of the legal system. Shanda had missed only one question on the bar exam. She'd worked as a law clerk for 2 judges. She understood the law better than most people. In September 2025, Judge Casel denied the motion for a new trial on grounds of incompetency. He found that Shanda had been competent to stand trial, that her decision to leave the courtroom was strategic rather than evidence of a mental break. However, Casel did indicate that Shanda had raised legitimate concerns about ineffective assistance of counsel, particularly regarding her attorney's decision to argue for a lesser charge without her consent. That issue remained to be explored in future proceedings. The appeal was a reminder that even with a life sentence, even with overwhelming evidence and a quick jury verdict, the legal process doesn't simply end. Shanda would likely continue to appeal, to seek new trials, to use her legal knowledge to try to escape the consequences of her actions. Whether any of these attempts would succeed remained to be seen, but most legal observers believed her conviction would stand. The evidence was simply too strong, the case too clear. Meanwhile, questions lingered about the other children. What happened to G, the youngest child who had witnessed Timothy's torture? What kind of trauma had he experienced, and what kind of support was he receiving? Court documents protected his identity and provided no information about his current circumstances, which was appropriate for a minor who was also a victim in his own way. Timothy's other siblings, the ones who hadn't lived with Shanda, were left to process an incomprehensible loss. Not only had they lost Timothy, but they'd learned that their own mother and brother had killed him. How do you process that? How do you come to terms with the fact that people who share your blood, your family, are capable of such evil? There were also systemic questions that demanded answers. Timothy had been pulled out of school and was supposedly being homeschooled, but there was no evidence of any educational activity, no check-ins from school officials, no verification that homeschooling was actually happening. In Michigan, as in many states, homeschooling regulations are minimal. Parents can simply notify the school district they're homeschooling, and that's basically it. There's no required curriculum, no testing, no verification that children are actually receiving an education. This lack of oversight meant that Timothy's isolation went unnoticed. If he'd been in school, teachers would have seen his physical deterioration. They would have noticed if he was losing weight, showing signs of abuse, struggling. They were mandatory reporters, required by law to report suspected abuse. But once Shanda pulled him out of school, that safeguard disappeared. Some advocates, including the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, have called for stricter homeschooling regulations in the wake of Timothy's death and similar cases. They argue that children have a right to be seen by adults outside their immediate family, that homeschooling can be a legitimate educational choice, but shouldn't be a way to hide abuse. But regulatory changes are difficult to implement, and balancing parental rights with child protection is complicated. As of early 2026, Michigan's homeschooling laws remain largely unchanged. There's also the question of whether anyone suspected what was happening. Did neighbors notice anything? Did extended family members have concerns? These questions remain largely unanswered. If people suspected abuse, they either didn't report it or their reports didn't result in intervention. This could imply either that the abuse was so well hidden that no one outside the household knew, or that warning signs were present but dismissed or ignored. Child Protective Services in Oklahoma had reportedly had contact with Shanda before she gave up her parental rights to her first 4 children. What were those contacts about? Were there concerns about her parenting even then? Could Timothy's death have been prevented if that history had been more thoroughly investigated when she sought to take custody of him? Most investigators agree that background checks and cross-state information sharing in custody cases need significant improvement. These are painful questions because they suggest that Timothy's death wasn't inevitable, that there were points where intervention might have saved him. But hindsight is always clearer than foresight, and the reality is that child protection systems are overwhelmed, underfunded, and often unable to prevent tragedies even when warning signs exist. Timothy Ferguson is buried at Sunset Memory Gardens in Mint Hill, North Carolina. His headstone bears the inscription, "Never Forgotten Son and Brother." It's a simple memorial for a boy whose life was anything but simple, whose death exposed depths of human cruelty that most people prefer not to believe exist. Those who knew Timothy before he went to live with Shanda remember him differently than the skeletal figure in those horrifying photographs. They remember a sweet kid who loved Legos and building things, who trusted people, who deserved so much better than what life gave him. They remember a child, not a victim, a person with personality and preferences and potential. Timothy never got to grow up. He never got to graduate high school, never got to fall in love, never got to discover who he might have become. His disabilities might have made some aspects of life more challenging, but with proper support and care, he could have lived a full, meaningful life. Instead, he got 14 months of torture followed by death at 15 years old. The case of Shanda Vander Ark is a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. They can be educated, professional, superficially normal. They can work in courthouses and have legal training and present a perfectly ordinary face to the world. And behind closed doors, they can commit acts of unspeakable cruelty. It's also a reminder of how vulnerable children are, especially children with special needs who depend on adults for basic care. Timothy couldn't protect himself. He was completely at the mercy of the people who were supposed to love him, and they showed him no mercy at all. As of February 2026, Shanda Vander Ark remains in prison, serving her life sentence. Paul Ferguson remains in prison, serving his 30 to 100-year sentence. They will likely both die behind bars, their names forever associated with one of the most horrific cases of child abuse in recent Michigan history. And Timothy Ferguson is gone, his life remembered not for what it was but for how it ended. That's the tragedy that can never be undone. A child suffered and died, and no amount of justice, no prison sentences, no trials or appeals or legal proceedings can change that fundamental fact. The best we can do is remember Timothy not as a victim in a case file, but as a person who deserved better. A boy who should have been protected, who should have been loved, who should have had the chance to live. His death should make us question our systems, should make us look more carefully at children who are isolated, should make us less willing to accept that everything is fine behind closed doors. Because if there's any lesson to be learned from Timothy Ferguson's death, it's that we can't assume children are safe just because we don't see them being hurt. Evil hides in plain sight. Abuse happens in nice neighborhoods, in families that look normal, in homes where you'd never suspect. And children die because adults fail to protect them. Timothy Ferguson deserved so much more than he got. He deserved a mother who loved him, a brother who protected him, a life where his disabilities were accommodated with patience and care. He deserved to grow up. Instead, he got Shanda Vander Ark, and that made all the difference. Rest in peace, Timothy. You are not forgotten.